Hello everyone, and welcome back to Their Own Words.
History from those who lived it.
My name is Danny.
And I'm Ava.
And today we're going to be talking about Florence Nightingale. Now, the Crimean War is what she is most famous for, and the British press during this time made her a hero as a result of her work there. Really, Victorian Britain wouldn't be what it was without the Crimean War, and it was very influential on many aspects of Victorian society. It influenced literature and culture. It wouldn't be the same scale as something like World War I or World War II, but it did have a similar impact as to what those wars would have on Western society in the 20th century. It lasted about 3 years, from 1853 to 1856, and was essentially Russia versus the Ottoman Empire, the latter being allied with Britain and France. So Florence Nightingale, aka the Lady with the Lamp, was a famous nurse. That's what she's known for. She essentially helped to professionalize nursing. Now, she was called the Lady with the Lamp because she used to walk among the wounded soldiers at Scutari, this place that's just outside Constantinople, at night with a light. And like I said, the British press really idolized her. She was made very famous, and Henry Wadsworth Longfellow actually wrote a poem in 1857 called Santa Filomena, where he says, "In that house of misery, a lady with a lamp I see." So that's where the phrase comes from. He's referring to Florence there.
She's largely responsible for sanitation standards in field hospitals during a time in history when sanitation standards were not the norm. And she was also instrumental in popularizing the idea of convalescence in recovery. Florence Nightingale was also key in getting trained nurses into the workhouses by the 1860s.
Caroline Worthington, who's the director of the Florence Nightingale Museum, had this to say: "When Nightingale started out, there was no such thing as nursing. The Dickens character Sarah Gamp, from Dickens's novel Martin Chuzzlewit, who was more interested in drinking gin than looking after her patients, was only a mild exaggeration. Hospitals were places of last resort, where the floors were laid with straw to soak up the blood. Florence transformed nursing when she got back from Crimea. She had access to people in high places, and she used it to get things done. Florence was stubborn, opinionated, and forthright, but she had to be those things in order to achieve all that she did." So that's a brief introduction to who Florence was. Without further ado, let's get into some of the primary source material.
So the primary sources that we're mainly going to be reading from are letters that Florence Nightingale wrote to various people. And we painstakingly transcribed these letters just for you because we got them from the original sources where she wrote in cursive handwriting. So sometimes it's difficult to read. This first letter is from the 5th of October, 1855, from Castle Hospital in Balaclava. So, for context, she's at Hospital Balaclava, which is not only where we get the modern term for face wrap from, but it's also where the very famous Charge of the Light Brigade, which is immortalized in Lord Tennyson's poem, took place in 1854. It reads, "My dear Madam, your letter was forwarded to me at this place where my hospital duties at present require me. I have desired that enquiries should be made of Dr. Blackwood concerning his attendance on your son." So on first read, it seems as though she is referring to a medical doctor who's caring for this woman's son. However, I researched this a bit and it turns out that she's actually referring here not to a medical doctor, but rather to a chaplain. So that's important context. "He remembers perfectly well being called in to him in the middle of the night, but when he reached him, he was quite unconscious. He remembers, however, hearing that he had been seen previously, earnestly in prayer. He also recollects hearing how much he was valued and beloved." Given the previous detail about Mr. Blackwood's being a chaplain, this note that Florence Nightingale makes here makes sense. She's clearly trying to comfort the woman to whom she's writing, who has clearly lost her son, by speaking to his spiritual state. So this obviously speaks to the nature of the importance of religion during Victorian times, which we've seen as kind of a motif throughout. The letter goes on. "I fear that it is impossible now to recover any of the articles which were sold, as I have already made enquiries of the purveyor to that effect. I will open the bale you speak of upon my return to Scutari, and let you know its contents. I trust that we shall not have the sufferings to deplore this winter, which we all witnessed last year. I beg to remain, dear madam, with true sympathy for your great loss, yours faithfully, Florence Nightingale."
So she takes time out of her obviously quite busy schedule to write this letter to comfort this mother. I think that's really quite remarkable. she's probably got massive demands on her time. And we know from our previous episode that her and Queen Victoria were in correspondence. And yet this regular mother whose son has unfortunately died, she takes the time to comfort her and remark on his spirituality to try and give her some assurance.
Which is clearly the most important thing still at this time, is the life of the spiritual, because she doesn't say, oh, he didn't suffer much or anything really to do with the physical. She remains focused on his spiritual state.
That's so true. Victorians had a very keen understanding of the life to come versus the present life, and that the life to come was the one that you should find comfort in, because this life was more often than not full of suffering.
Yeah. So this next letter is dated 18th of January, 1856, so just before the end of the Crimean War, and it's a letter from the Scutari Barrack Hospital. It reads, Madam, in reply to your letter of January 4th, I am very happy to be able to inform you that William Edward Austin, 2nd Dragoon Guards, and then in brackets she's got written Scotch Greys, went home to England December 11th, 1855. So that's about a month ago. I therefore return to you his wife's letters, and trust that ere this her heart is lightened of its troubles. Remain your obedient servant, Florence Nightingale.
So for context, the Dragoon Guards were a part of the Scots Greys, which was a cavalry regiment in existence from about 1707 to 1971.
Okay, this next letter is from Yoxall Cottage Hospital, dated 4th of April, 1872. It reads, Dear Madam, if it is decided to erect a cottage hospital at this place, these plans seem admirably suited for the purpose. Mr. Alex Graham is indeed an architect for hospitals, in whose opinion every confidence may be safely placed. Number 1. The proposed change in the position of the shop sink should be adopted. Number 2. As regards earth closets generally, wherever there is water and a drainage outlet, there will necessarily be an outlet for the bath water, sink water, lavatory water, and cooking water. Now, this should not be allowed to run into ditches. The best is to run it over grassland, and if this is done, there might just as well be 2 water closets as 2 earth closets. Earth closets require great and constant care, which they seldom receive. I cannot give an opinion as to their use unless there is no outlet for the house draining, and it has to be carted away. If so, then earth closets might be tried. If there is an outlet for drainage, then use water closets. But an earth closet must be completely cut off from the building by a cross-ventilated passage. Thus...
And then she's got a drawing there demonstrating what her ideal layout would look like. We'll post this on our website, by the way, so you guys can see it as well.
So the next line of her letter reads, Not only must the earth be put in from the outside, but the tank must also be removable from the outside.
So she's beginning to talk about earth closets, which, for those that don't know, are basically what we would think of as an outhouse, but there's earth put in a metal container or wooden container underneath the toilet, which is meant to absorb the waste and the smell. Then there was actually a job for some people to go around and empty these buckets out regularly, which would not have been fun.
Number 3. If the closet for earth attached to the wash house is to be an earth closet, it must be properly lighted and ventilated. 2 earth closets are undoubtedly necessary. Number 4. The cellars must not open into the building. They must be reached from outside. Number 5. Whether for so small a hospital, a porcelain fixed bath is needed, we could do very well with a movable bath in the sink.
Yeah, this is funny to me. It's like a porcelain bath is an unnecessary extravagance. She's a veteran battlefield nurse, so she has definitely seen a lot worse, and I think here she just thinks, let's not do this, let's just keep it simple.
Number 6. In such a small place, would hot and cold water laid on be necessary? The kitchen is close at hand, and one would say a big pan or jug would do everything. Number 7. It is very much easier to separate properly 100 men from 100 women, with their separate pavilions, ward appurtenances, and nurses, than it is to separate 2 from 2, unless they be for quite young children. The objections are so very great to letting the 2 sexes use 1 water closet, 1 bath, etc., especially as where in this case the one sex would actually pass the other's door on the way, that they have probably been considered.
This is a great example of the very strict sense of morality and propriety that characterized Victorian times. It was actually unthinkable that men and women would share toilets or baths, or ever even have the slightest opportunity to peer in on each other improperly clothed. it's almost surprising that she mentions it. I mean, she says right in the letter that this has likely already been taken into account by the person she's writing to. It's just a given that you're not going to let this happen.
Yeah. Number 8. Will not the spare ward be rather hot in summer, next to the kitchen and with a western exposure, for a bad case?
Yeah, I think here she may be suggesting that people, specifically with fevers and things, may be too warm given the location of the spare ward in the plans.
Okay, number 9. I could not undertake to criticise an estimate as to expense, farther than in the most general manner, as to leaving out expensive ornamental style and the like, which in this case is not needed. Mr. Alex Graham is entirely to be trusted in all these respects, of ability and honour. Number 10. I quite agree that the steps will be very inconvenient. Pray believe me, dear madam, ever your faithful servant, Florence Nightingale.
So she finished the letter, but then she thought of another couple recommendations she wanted to add, so we actually have 4 more that get added before the letter is eventually sent.
Okay. Number 11. The kitchen is so near that the range with oven for nurse's room might possibly be omitted, provided that in the kitchen there were all conveniences for sick cookery, including those facilities for airing and warming linen, for fomentations, and the like. Fomentation in this sense is like a poultice. Okay, so she then signs a FN, letting you know that she added this little addendum herself, and then number 12 follows in pencil. So number 12 reads, a linen room ought to be so thoroughly warm, airy, light, and dry, that if it has not a fireplace of its own, I should almost have wished it had been against the kitchen fireplace. The kitchen fire is good for the linen, and not for the patient. Also, the exposure is east. Want of sun has a bad effect on linen, which should have either sun or fire, or better, both. FN.
Then we have number 12 again, and she's writing in pen again. I almost picture her just having this letter lying around her house for a while she continues to ruminate on the plans, because she switches to pencil, I guess, because she couldn't find a pen one day, and then back to pen. But anyway, it seems unlikely that she lost count, but she also writes this as number 12 again. So I don't know why there's no number 13, but this is technically number 13, even though it's labeled as number 12.
So yes, it reads, is it not necessary to have a small surgery where the doctor can sit down, where he can examine a patient before admission, or even afterwards, and where the few necessary drugs can be kept? It is most undesirable that the doctor should have no place which he can use except the nurse's room. A linenry is not absolutely necessary for so small a number of beds. Indeed, I have known a good linen press, not let into the wall, in a dry, light, airy, warm part of the corridor, with a folding dresser made on hinges to stand out from the wall, and be let down when not in use, to fold the linen upon. Answer much better than the dark closet usually assigned to the linen in small English hospitals. Linen is as jealous as a patient of light and air for its good health. This criticism is not, however, meant for the linenry in the Yoxall plan, which is much better than usually afforded, for a much larger hospital. If it were turned into the surgery, it would require a fireplace.
And the last one is recommendation number 14.
It reads, how would it do to make it both surgery and linenry? It may here be noticed that for any kind of stores to be kept or any sort of hospital work to be going on in the nurse's room is very undesirable. Also, that in planning a cottage hospital where the nurse's room was between a man and a woman's ward, as in this case a partition and door kept locked, entirely cut off the men's from the women's side.
So again, make sure you lock that door. We don't want any women and men consorting.
The nurse's room had 2 doors, one on either side of the partition, and there was, of course, water closet, bath, and sink provision for each side. So a very long letter with very many points and very many addenda.
So she actually writes at the bottom, Dear Madam, this codicil, which is another word for like an addition, occurred to me afterward, after I'd written to you on the 4th. Ever your faithful servant, Florence Nightingale. She signs off. So let's talk a little bit about the fresh linens. If you thought light and airy was a term that HGTV shows had coined, I guess Florence Nightingale was first. So this was really important to her. I was reading a History Extra article, and apparently in 1825, visitors to St. George's Hospital in London discovered mushrooms and maggots thriving in a patient's damp, dirty sheets.
So gross.
And what's crazy is apparently the man didn't even complain about this. And, quote, neither did any of his fellow bedmates think the squalor especially noteworthy, end quote. So this was the state of hospitals pre-Florence, and obviously there's a reason she's so particular about mentioning this We need clean linens. They're as jealous for fresh air as a patient is. So that was a really important transition that came about because of her work.
Yeah, she was really instrumental in standardizing practices within hospitals, in standardizing sanitary practices within hospitals. Because at this time, even the washing of hands was not a very common practice. And we think of that today as shocking. It's the most natural thing for us, or for most of us, that comes after going to the toilet. You wash your hands. But this was actually not a common practice back in Florence Nightingale's day and had only really just been introduced. And so she was very much a trailblazer in health and sanitation standards within hospitals.
Yeah, there's some scholarly debate on whether or not she was a believer in germs, but she definitely, I think, had graduated slightly from the more simplistic bad air theory, which sort of dominated previous eras. And she copped onto this idea that we need clean hands and clean rooms.
Another thing I want to note is number 13, or number 12 again, when she talks about having a small surgery. It seems that up to this point, the doctors didn't have a surgery or a room of their own. And now, when we think about going to the doctor, so when you go to your family doctor or walk-in clinic, you go into a room that is essentially the doctor's surgery, where he or she will sit down and assess you and prescribe you, the necessary drugs. And I wonder if this is where the idea of a doctor's surgery was born. In this time as well, outside of the battlefield, oftentimes doctors would go to patients' houses. They did not have a place where people would come to them. And now that seems so foreign to us, having the idea of having a doctor come to us. We go to the doctor. And so I do wonder if this is kind of where that came from.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it was very common for doctors to visit people in their homes well up into maybe even the 1950s. But we did start to get this idea of going to visit the doctor in the doctor's surgery or at a hospital around this time. Okay, so moving on, we have a diary entry from a nurse that worked under Florence Nightingale. She was training at St. Thomas's Hospital in London, which, fun fact, is now owned by King's College in London and is used as the Florence Nightingale School of Nursing, which is pretty cool. So this girl was required to keep a diary whilst a nurse, and this was something apparently that Nightingale insisted on for all of her students. So we get a little glimpse here of nursing school in 1896. The key thing to notice here is how much cleaning takes place, something we've just been talking about. This was all due to Florence. Again, there were no nurses in a professional sense until she came along, and hospitals were dirty, infectious places. But here, we'll get to see a little bit of the practices that Florence was insistent upon incorporating when she was training new nurses.
So this diary entry was written by an E. Knight, and it was written on June 26, 1896, from the Children's Ward in Victoria. Commenced at 7 a.m. by washing 15 and 16, two little girls, one suffering from hip disease, who has an extension, the other from abscesses on back. Washed and combed their heads with dust comb, dressed them, made their beds and took temperatures. Then went over to the other side of the ward and washed 5, a boy with hip disease whose leg has an extension on. Went to table for prayers. Washed and dressed 6, a boy who is now convalescent after operation on cleft palate and is allowed to get up and run about. And 9, a boy with tubercular elbow, which is supported in a sling. Washed and combed heads, took temperatures and made their beds. Filled a hot water bottle for one of the babies, finishing by 8:30. Dusted down both sides of the ward and small ward. Cleaned the bathroom, polishing taps, washing and drying basins, oiling slabs and wiping down window ledges, and tidied up generally. Scrubbed 3 sheet macintoshes and 6 or 7 small ones. Changed the stone cloths and gave bedpans to the children, all down night nurse's side of the ward. Finishing by 10:15. Looked through some clean bibs, putting aside those that needed mending, and went off duty at 10:30. Back in the ward at 1:30 p.m. Made my 6 little patients clean for the afternoon, washing faces and hands, brushing hair, changing stone cloths, and putting clean pinafores on those who needed them. Filled jugs on surgery and doctors' tables. Washed wine glasses and made up the fire. Carbolized and put away dressing macintoshes and put away clean stone cloths. Helped to tidy cupboards and sat down at table to pad splints until 3:45.
So we mentioned this at the beginning of the entry, but let's review here a little bit. She's talking about combing their hair and washing their faces, changing out the linens. This is constantly a preoccupation to clean everything and all the kids. And obviously this is an effort to try and keep disease spread down.
And it seems also to be about tidiness and method as well. She talks about going through the bibs and putting aside those that needed mending. She also talks about going through and organizing cupboards, washing the wine glasses. And she also, which I found interesting, refers to the patients by number, which is a very methodical thing to do. 15 and 16, number 5, number 9. And she knows all the ailments associated with each number, with each child.
Yeah, I think numbering the patients seems to us a bit foreign and impersonal, but this is a time when there wasn't really probably any data around patients. Probably a lot of the patients couldn't spell their names, and so numbering them was an easy way to keep track of what was going on with each person.
And that's the greatness of Florence Nightingale's legacy. She brought cleanliness and order and tidiness to a sector of society that didn't have this systematically.
Yeah, before Florence Nightingale, hospitals were essentially chaos, and she brought order to the chaos.
Yeah.
So there you have it, guys. That's a glimpse into the life of Florence Nightingale, the famed Lady of the Lamp. Obviously, her legacy is massive, so she really is an important Victorian to hear from. She was very instrumental in improving hygiene practices, and as you can see from her letters, she was very meticulous about what she did. As always, thank you so much for listening, and if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can email us at theirownwordspod@gmail.com.
Tune in next week when we talk about Ada Lovelace.